Hi everyone, I am here with let me just restart that. Sawyer. Hi everyone, I am here with Josh. I'm gonna
You know,
get
my
this.
parents really did not consider the sibilance of my name when they picked it for me.
Josh Sawyer. Josh Sawyer. Okay. Hello everyone, I'm here with Josh Sawyer of Obsidian. We are here to talk about the origins of Eora and the Pillars of Eternity universe. Josh, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
We're on the precipice of this game, Avowed, releasing, which has its roots in the Pillars of Eternity games that you led direction on. And I just wanted to kind of kickstart with what made you birth Pillars of Eternity into this world?
So it started with an idea that one of my former coworkers, Nathaniel Chapman, had, which was we should have a Kickstarter game. I think it was around the time that Double Fine had their Kickstarter, and a lot of the people at the studio were really like, we should do something that is kind of a throwback to the games that we made back at Black Isle. And there are a few ideas that were thrown around, and I proposed that we make a game that blended kind of Icewind Dale dungeon crawling with Baldur's Gate world exploration and Torment philosophical themes. You know, trying to get all the Infinity Engine games kind of in one game, which is a pretty maybe a pretty advanced goal, I guess. But then Adam Brennecke had the idea for a fantasy world where the kind of main hook of it is that souls reincarnated, and that was sort of an understood thing by the people of the world, and it kind of drove everything in the world. And from that starting point, I started conceiving of a world that didn't feel completely foreign in terms of its fantasy. So it was rooted in the fantasy of settings like the Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk, which are very familiar to a lot of D&D players. And we wanted to include certain things like elves and dwarves, but then we did want to have our own spin on things. And of course, that central concept of reincarnation and souls was also very central to it. So I started developing a lot of the basic ideas of the place where the first game would take place, which is the Eastern Reach, the Deerwood, and Irglanfath. Around the same time, another former Obsidianite, George Zeitz, helped me flesh out what the pantheon of the gods would be in Eora. And then I just started kind of going from there. So really the idea was we want to have a fantasy setting that is welcoming to people that enjoy traditional fantasy, let's say, but also has enough new things in it for players to discover that they're intrigued by the setting and want to learn more about it.
Yeah, the game has so many unique aspects to it, and so many kind of metaphysical aspects to it. You have things like the in between, the beyond, the very concept of the souls reincarnating is core to the gameplay. Was that something where all of those ideas were kind of came from that initial concept of reincarnation, and everything kind of spread out from there? Or was it something a little bit more like they all came, from different places? How the origins, I guess, of all of those concepts?
I mean, a lot of them were, trying to find ways to work in, the sort of, let's say, traditional classes of D&D, but fitting them into the metaphysical concept of souls and soul energy essence, the reincarnation cycle. Like, where do wizards get their power? Where do chanters get their power? And a chanter is kind of like a bard, but not really. Where do paladins get their power? Because paladins in Eora are kind of like paladins in D&D, but not exactly. And so it kind of was a give and take over time. It was pretty organic. Again, I knew that because we were making something that in many ways was, a throwback, and we're very clear in our Kickstarter where we are trying to capture the spirit of these older games, that in some ways necessitated we got to have paladins, we got to have bards, we got to have rangers, we have to have all these things. So then the question largely became, how do we include these, but then wrap them within these metaphysical concepts so that they feel rooted in this world. So, for example, the idea that wizards' grimoires are kind of channeling devices for essence. They pull the magical essence from the in between into their grimoire, and then the grimoire shapes it, and then they send it out. Or that the chanters, when they are chanting, are evoking the ancestral memories of the souls that are sort of fragmented in the in between. And it's kind of like a call and reply thing where they call out these ancient poems or songs, and then the energy in the in between hears that and remembers it and kind of sends the energy to the chanter to make that real. So, I will say it was it was also a very fast process. So if I tried to give you an accurate recollection of exactly what happened at every step, I'd
Sure.
be lying, because the Kickstarter took off really quickly, and I had to fill in a lot of blanks much faster than I was expecting to.
I've been there where a project success has almost bit you in the ass because they're like, oh, now I have to like make good on a
Oh,
lot of this
yeah,
stuff as quickly as possible.
very quickly.
Now, it's really interesting that you talk about like the idea of, for pillars kind of coming from this, from the idea of like let's do a Kickstarter game. And that was a very interesting period across not just what Double Fine was doing, what you guys were doing, and then things like Fig sprouting up and this kind of close relationship to creating a game directly in line with your audience. Um, did that experience kind of meet the expectations of the team beyond just kind of like the game being a massive kind of surprise success, maybe? And what was that experience like of kind of crafting this world lockstep with the community?
It was certainly an interesting experience. I will say this audience has they're broader in their taste than you might think, but also they have very specific tastes.
Sure.
So there's a lot of people that want a lot of very specific things. And I mean, one of the appeals about playing D&D is, if there's a character concept, you can probably make it. So, everyone's sort of asking for the thing that they most like in D&D or in the old Infinity Engine games to be present. So a lot of demands from a lot of different people, which, sometimes that could be difficult. But what I will say, and I think we all have said consistently, is I would much rather hear those requests directly from the audience early and think about how to accommodate them rather than like kind of do things in the dark until a publisher does a focus test and like that whole process that's very traditional in game development. It was nice, especially for a throwback game, to interact directly with the fans, even if the fans could sometimes be very spicy. So I prefer being able to talk about things earlier and over time so that we can develop them on a longer time scale. We also
Mhm.
had our backer beta, and that was extremely useful. There were so many,
Mm.
things that we saw that either, did work and we got positive feedback, or more importantly, didn't work. And then we're like, oh god, we gotta we gotta update this, and then the backers would give their feedback. And no, so I think it was a very healthy process overall. But the source games were so beloved by so many people that it did put a lot of pressure on us to really fulfill a lot of expectations, which can be daunting.
Talking about those source games and the 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 audience's kind of approach to them versus on the development side. I actually was chatting with your friend and colleague Fergus for my podcast Hit the Limit Break, and we talked about like wanting to develop new games like these old games, but obviously the tools and what development looks like now is vastly different from what it was like back then.
Yeah.
Can you talk to kind of the balance of trying to build a game that is very much taking inspiration from those old source games, but balancing out the old way of game development with the new?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that people will notice, even in Pillars 1, but it's especially apparent in Deadfire, is how much more integrated and sort of dynamic the 3D characters and landscapes look. Um, so the process by which we author the levels, I'm not going to say it was easy back in the day, but basically, we would render those levels out, And then we would have an artist. Very often, that artist was Brian Menzies, who's still with Obsidian. And he would go through and he'd do these wonderful 2D paint overs. And then we'd have what we call a clipping mask to sort of determine sorting. So if a character walked behind something, it would properly sort them in the scene. And then we were kind of done with it. There was also like a lighting mask, but it was very, very simple and primitive. So the way that we built them for Pillars and Deadfire was quite involved. It involved building the 3D scene, rendering it out. There are all these different maps for dynamic lighting because we actually dynamically light the 2D scene using the 3D data in a depth map, like a 2D image. It's all very technical and very crazy. So, I mean, the engineers on the team did an incredible job getting the stuff to work. And it's very impressive, but it was also very time consuming. And then there were certain principles that we could really stick to. So, kind of our principles of level design in an isometric game where perspective is kind of tricky. You know, a lot of the rules that we used and things that we did to help the player and not confuse them in the good old days, we continue to use because those rules still applied. Basic principles of pacing and level design we could still use, but then there were other things where we really had to take a strong look at quality of life features. You know, the Infinity Engine games are old games, and a lot of times when people go back to the old games, the biggest difficulty they have is dealing with interfaces. And the Infinity Engine games, especially if you look at the enhanced editions, they made a lot of quality of life improvements because they were not smooth and easy games to play. So for Pillars and Deadfire, we put a lot of emphasis on saying we want to support all the stuff the player could do, but we want to make it way easier to interact with the world, way less frustrating, lot less time wasted. And I think we did a pretty good job of that. And you know, I have noticed some people say that they go from the Pillars game and then they go back to play the Infinity Engine games, and even the enhanced edition, that's kind of a shock. So yeah, obviously we want to capture the spirit, but that doesn't necessarily mean making the interface frustrating to deal with or anything like that.
I myself, especially after checking out, you know, Pillars of Eternity, after playing something like Baldur's Gate last year, Diablo 4, I play a lot with my partner. I've been like, oh, let me boot up, like, you know, they did enhanced editions of all the classics. Like there's Diablo 2 Resurrected and Baldur's Gate Definitive Edition, all this stuff. And I'm still like, oh no, like there's fundamentally some stuff here that makes it a little impenetrable. But yeah, it's interesting to think about how to kind of navigate that balance. Obviously, you know, when you, as you've already alluded to, when you started this project, you started the Kickstarter, things rapidly kind of rocketed from there. Things came together really quickly. But in your mind, like when you look back on Pillars 1 and, you know, even 2, is it kind of aligned with that initial vision? Or, you know, if you could go to yourself at the very beginning of that process and bring those games back and show them to that Josh, would he be like, what the fuck is going on? Like, how is this, you know, what do you think he would say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there probably was more, you know, the games wound up feeling maybe more traditional than I expected them to in the end.
Interesting.
Because in a lot of ways, like I didn't know, like, to be honest, we weren't even really that confident that we would get funded. And once we were funded and there were so many backers, and some of the things that people really clung to in some ways surprised me. Like, you know, they really wanted six attributes, ability scores. And I had kind of self-imposed a goal of making sure that all the attributes were useful for all the classes,
Sure.
and which they often aren't in D&D. And so six of them made it really challenging. And, you know, initially, like there were four, and it was a lot of things like that, like little things that seemed to me to be things that we could easily change. But people were really like steadfast of like, no, I want this, you know, like I want six characters in the party, which I kind of felt was like maybe one too many. And then in Deadfire, we did go down to five, which even though people did complain about it, I still think it was the right choice. But it's a difficult balancing act because we, you know, we pitched everything as a throwback. So if we deviate too much from the expectations of the audience, which we can't know, we can try to intuit, then they're going to get mad.
Yeah.
So, in some ways, I do think they're a little more conservative with design than I thought that they possibly could be. But in terms of the world and the setting, I'm still very happy with it. I do think that, especially on the first game, I directed things to be a little more dense than maybe
Yeah.
they should have been. And so I heard a lot of feedback from that. And on the second game, even though we did try to not completely go in a different direction, I did try to ease off of that and not lore dump so much on the player. I had some in a quite actually conservative way. I had an idea of when I was a kid, I remember when I would get like the boxed set for Greyhawk or the boxed set for Forgotten Realms, first edition, and I would open those up and I would spend a lot of time because I didn't have internet. Nobody had internet.
Sure.
And I would just read the books. And so I spent a lot of time just reading about the setting way in
Mm.
advance of making characters. And I spent a lot of time just absorbing lore without playing the game. And then when I did get together with other people, I had a really in-depth knowledge of it, and I could make a character very quickly. And all the cultural references came very, very fast to me, and that stuff really stuck to me. So I remember this was a while ago, maybe 8 years ago or so. Someone ran a Greyhawk campaign, and I hadn't played in Greyhawk in like decades, actually, but I remembered the lore. I was able to like get into it, and I made a character very quickly that was very lore accurate. But that process of sort of sitting with the books and really absorbing the lore, that was such a formative part of appreciating those settings
Yeah.
that on Pillars of Eternity, I was like, when you're making a character, you see walls of text and like all these names and gods and cultures and wars. And it never occurred to me that people would be like, hey man, I'm trying to make a character.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I saw a lot of feedback where people were like, man, this is way too, I can't absorb all this stuff. I'm trying to just make a character and play the game. So yeah, there were certain things like that where in retrospect, I thought, yeah, this did not go the way that I thought it would. And I have to take responsibility for it. So
I mean, it's. I'm sure if you hadn't done that, there'd be some people who were like, "Hey, where was my lore dump? Like, I love reading all this."
there
So
are probably better places to put it than character creation.
potentially, but I mean, these games are very beloved, and I think like as the further we get away from them, I think like people look at them as fondly as they do look back on things like Icewind Dale and Baldur's Gate. So I don't
That would
think
be
you have
nice.
anything to necessarily worry about there. Well, we're on the precipice of this new release in the world of Aora, and building off of what you have done with Pillars. I know you're not directly involved with the project, but I'm sure you have been witness to the production, and I'm sure that the team has tapped you at points. What has your experience been like watching the baton pass almost off, especially because it's not like this team is making Pillars 3. They are making a completely different game. Um, has it been tough to kind of see that as how personally you are connected to these games, or have you been very much hands off with this experience?
I try to not, I made this very, very conscientiously develop this setting for Obsidian. And, I would be lying if there's not a lot of the things that I personally like in the setting,
Of
but I've
course.
never considered it to be mine. It's made for the company to use. And I'm not the boss of it. And and I also realize that different audiences and different types of games, there's a different focus for things. So, it's a very different experience making because I've also worked on first person, sort of more open world RPGs, and the moment to moment focus and what the player is thinking about and considering both in gameplay and lore, it's just a different experience. So,
Yeah.
I always give my opinion if I'm asked for it. Uh, but we're not making, Avowed is not Pillars of Eternity 3, and it's not for like it's not for the audiences of Pillars 1 and 2, but it is for a different, let's say, subset or greater set of that audience. So the considerations for how narrative approach is approached, how game mechanics is approached and expressed in the world. I usually will give my opinions where I feel like, for example, let's say there's some iconic ability or item or thing like that. I will say, I think if we're translating it in from isometric into first person, these are the things that I think you have to keep to make it feel true. And you can change all the other things about it mechanically, but if it doesn't kind of keep one foot in the past, then it'll feel disconnected.
Yeah.
And it's less about completely recreating something, which is not, I don't think, important and often is not good for the player experience. And it's more about maintaining enough continuity that the IP feels like, it's adjacent, like we're moving into a different space for the IP to be explored. But yeah, so, I always knew that if we were going to make other games that were not party-based isometric games, that there was going to have to be a shift of focus and a shift of the way that the world is portrayed. And I think that's just part of the deal. So I'm just here to give my opinion when asked.
Yeah, I think that it's great to have that. I think that's the right way to approach it. If I was, in your shoes of this, not, kind of being the mysterious wizard in the back who's there to provide guidance when needed, but kind of let the team run with it, especially because it's set in a different part of the world.
Exactly.
I feel like so many games, simply because, and this pertains to every kind of form of entertainment, but the real world is such a diverse place. You go to the other side of it, it can almost be completely something that you can't even recognize. And when you're building something and you're like a god who is like creating this, manipulating, shaping this world, there can be limitations on it that don't necessarily feel natural. And I think, like, if it's something that's like set in a different part of this world, a different realm, like there's gonna be things that are going to feel radically different and unique from what came before. So yeah, very excited to see how all that plays out with Avowed. And I was doing research before this, and I saw you recently actually spoke to Pillars 3, what your interest level is in making that, and something to the effect of would needing a Baldur's Gate 3 size budget to make it happen. I'm sure there's a lot of emotions in the ideas of making a Pillars 3, but has this opportunity that Obsidian has taken with Avowed to adapt a completely new game in the world of Pillars? You've obviously worked on the incredible game Pentiment, which has nothing to do with any of this, but is this really unique small experience. It feels like Obsidian is really stretching its legs with everything that it's doing. Is there an interest in returning to the Pillars world in some completely different fashion for you that isn't necessarily what Pillars 1 and 2 were, what Avowed is?
I mean, personally, yes. And I know, like, there have been a number of people actually at the studio who have floated the idea of a Pillars Tactics game. And tactics games are interesting.
Josh, I'm going to need you to make that, okay?
I know the tactics games are very interesting to me, and they occupy a really interesting space in the marketplace because the audience for them is not huge typically, but very passionate. Like people that are into SRPGs, tactical RPGs, they'll play a lot of them, even if they're not that good. But the cap on it is sort of like not huge. There are breakout hits, of course.
Yeah.
Fire Emblem is one of the ones that people often think of.
Sure.
But it's something that a number of people have talked about and thought about. It's a hard one to make a case for, like, how big should it be? What should the size of the team be?
Yeah.
And, we, every once in a while, we'll bring it up and kind of be like, oh, we could maybe, I don't know, we could maybe. So I will say that, not just for myself, but there's a lot of other people at the studio who have pitched their own versions of a Pillars Tactics game. So who knows, maybe someday.
I have my fingers crossed. I'm a massive tactics fan, and I can't think of a better fit. Honestly, that's a great genre for it to
I think
explore.
it could be really cool.
So, and again, Obsidian has really stretched its wings, I think, with all of the different team sizes, genres, mediums that it's exploring. So I think that I'm not Fergus here approving it, but I think there's room for it, Fergus, if you're watching this. Well, Josh, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today about Pillars.